been actually mainly off the field stuff. It's been quite an eventful match day 27. So as always, let's look into it. So on Friday, it was El Plastico, or RB Leipzig versus Hoffenheim. And obviously, this was a big game in the context of trying to qualify for the Champions League, because Hoffenheim were currently third, while Leipzig were just outside in fifth. However, what the hell? Leipzig absolutely thrashed Hoffenheim. It was 5-0. It was actually 4-0 at half time. It could have been 5-0 at half time too, but Leipzig had a goal disallowed through VAR just before the break. And it was just a ruthless performance from Leipzig with Diomande and Brian Gruder, the standouts. Gruder with 2 goals and an assist. Diomande with just the assist. Christoph Baumgartner, not Diomande. Baumgartner scored twice. Again, Baumgartner's been on smoke this year. It's ridiculous. So he has now scored 12 goals and has 6 assists in 26 games, which is obviously by far his best season of his career to date. Well, Gruder has obviously found his feet since moving from Brighton on loan in January, and maybe you can make the argument that the move to Brighton came too early for him and he should have taken this step. So we've gone from Mainz to a bigger Bundesliga club in the context of the table, so Leipzig, Dortmund, Leverkusen, whatever. Because now he's finding his feet, and although he hasn't been called up for this international break, if he continues his form, obviously he could play for Germany in the World Cup in the summer. But what this does mean is Leipzig have leapfrogged Hoffenheim, so Hoffenheim have dropped down to 5th now, and slowly but surely, their Champions League dream may be dying, because they've only won once in their last 5 games, and they've really hit a wall. So either it's the fact that they've been found out, or their really intense and aggressive style of play is actually catching up with them now, and they're just becoming increasingly more tired, thus allowing them to drop points in these games, or it's both. Hoffenheim being found out, and they're just becoming increasingly more tired, and so they're just running on. They're approaching the red, and then what doesn't help is the constant noise surrounding the team. The noise, in fact, of the names who could potentially leave in the summer: Aslani, Lemperle, Torre, Prummel's leaving, Wouter Berg has been linked with a move away. So you basically have quite a big core of the team being linked with departures already. So I think this is all just a perfect storm. And also the fact that they're just inexperienced. I think we forget that this is a team that this time last year was fighting relegation. And so the fact that they're now on the decline, whatever, they're approaching the norm now. They're approaching where they really should be. It's just up to Leverkusen, for example, to book up their ideas and close the gap on them. Then on Saturday, obviously the standout game was the Rhine derby between Borussia Mönchengladbach and Cologne. Obviously, it's had a bit more of a twist to it due to the fact that both teams are fighting relegation. So they both needed to win, not only for the perspective of winning the bragging rights, but also you need the points. And this was a real derby. It had the intensity, it had the drama, it had everything that derbies have begun to lack. And it started off at a breakneck intensity. Borussia Mönchengladbach opened the scoring within the first minute through Jens Kastrop. Then Seidel Mahler equalised. Ragnar Acker then took the lead. Gladbach then equalised again. Gladbach then scored through Kastrop again after half-time. And then Eric Martel, just before the 90th minute, looked like he did rescue a point for Cologne. And then he got sent off 2 minutes later. So a very quick from hero to zero. And this was really a bit like a revenge game for both Kastrop and Elmala. So Kastrop was let go by Cologne before they allowed him to move to Nuremberg because they didn't give him the time. And Elmala was let go by Borussia Mönchengladbach earlier on in the career. So both of them scoring either on opposite sides of the previous team they were on is quite funny. The pick of the goals was obviously Kastrop's, the second one. It was a nice long-range effort that went top corner. I think, if I remember correctly, it even hit the crossbar on its way in. And the team that will be happy enough with that point is Borussia Mönchengladbach, because they're now 5 points clear of 16th. However, for Cologne, they're only 2 points away from 16th. So a win here, and they could have opened the gap a bit more, but they didn't win. And ultimately, what that did in that point, it meant Lukas Kwasniok was sacked. He'd obviously been in charge in the summer, came in. Cologne had a very good start, but then the wheels very quickly came off, and they've now gone 5 months with only 2 wins, which is a very impressive stat, if we're being honest. Like, to be that rubbish, to achieve such a thing, fair enough. He's been replaced by his assistant coach, who's on an interim basis. At the beginning of the season, I said Cologne were overperforming, and their result to type. And people came at me. Well, I said they performed well against easy teams, and people came at me saying we played hard teams. Ultimately, the season has shown that those teams that they played against were not hard teams to play against, and they were punching. And speaking of vindication, I was not the only one to be vindicated by this. Saido Malo was as well. He is obviously one of Cologne's top scorers this season. In fact, I think he's the top scorer this season. And he's been benched quite a few times for Kwasniok. So whether the new head coach, who was Kwasniok's assistant, plays El Malo, is obviously yet to be seen. But if he does, and El Malo continues to perform and leads Cologne away from the relegation fight, then things could be different. This probably impacted the result of Kwasniok's future. Bremen beat Wolfsburg 1-0, which means Bremen are now 4 points clear of St. Pauli and 2 clear of Cologne. This was decided by Justin Jinma, and it also helped that Mio Backhaus put in several important saves. But for Wolfsburg, the fact that they've lost an important relegation 6-pointer, it means the gap to safety has grown. They're now 5 points clear of or behind Cologne in 15th. As time goes on, if you're not being able to beat the team that usually you would think Wolfsburg could beat Bremen, if you're not able to do that, then it drastically reduces the chances that you're actually going to survive. And I think this is a crucial loss for Wolfsburg, because if you look at who they play against in their final 7 games, they only play 2 teams that are within the relegation realm, St. Pauli and Borussia Mönchengladbach. And if you're not able to beat Bremen, then the doubt increases that you're going to be able to beat the likes of St. Pauli and Borussia Mönchengladbach, as well as the fact that they have to play Bayern Munich, Bayer Leverkusen, Eintracht Frankfurt and Freiburg, as well as Union Berlin away. So looking at the fixture list, I don't think it's likely that Wolfsburg are going to be able to stay up. I just don't think they have it in them anymore. I think this is a team that's so devoid of every sort of confidence or whatever that they're not going to be able to do it. Because if you're going to have some sort of revival, it had to happen then, and had to begin then, but it didn't. And I think this just increases the chances of Wolfsburg getting relegated. And Heidenheim drew 3-3 with Leverkusen. I think it's safe to say that Leverkusen are running out of steam. I mean, they've only won once in the last 5 games, and they've drawn the other 4. They threw away a 2-0 lead against dead last, which is a bit of a problem. So I just think Leverkusen are kind of just limping to the end of the season. Obviously, their season isn't completely over because they are still in the DFB Pokal against Bayern, which, as I said last week, if they put in a performance like they did when they played them, then I think they'll be okay. But they truly hit a wall here, like Hoffenheim actually too. And they're 4 points away from the play or the Champions League places. Obviously, 5th could potentially become Champions League spot, but it's still not certain. In fact, it's looking unlikely. And I just think, obviously, this is an underperformance for Leverkusen considering the money they spent, but I think we also have to take into consideration the fact that this is a team in transition. Obviously, there's talk now that maybe Leverkusen may get rid of Kasper Heumann in the summer. Obviously, that would make sense if they could hire an upwardly mobile coach to take them back towards the way of Xabi Alonso, for example. And we also forget that the season's been so long that they did fire Erik ten Hag right at the beginning of it, which seems like ages ago. But yeah, Leverkusen are struggling. Obviously, if they lose to Wolfsburg, then it will show that how they're struggling. And then Bayern beat Union 4-0. There's nothing really else to say to this. It's as dead rubber as it can get. Like, Bayern are going to win the league. There's not really more we can say. Then on Saturday evening, Borussia Dortmund played Hamburg. They came back from 2-0 down to win 3-2. Hard done by on Hamburg because they did put in a good performance in the first half. Dortmund were horrible, then they kind of switched. Dortmund did have 4 penalty calls in this game too. One was disallowed because it was offside. And then the other one was missed by Felix Metscher before Benzabaini came on and scores 2. But the biggest story related to, in fact, it could be related to Hamburg too, is the fact on Sunday, Dortmund then decided they were going to sack Sebastian Kehl, the sporting director. Obviously, Kehl came in 2022 to replace Michael Zorc. There's been reports that tension between him and director of sport, Lars Ricken, who's his boss. And obviously then there's doubts about Ricken too, and so the future of Ricken is decided by the likes of Watzke and Kramer, while the future of Kehl is decided by Ricken. So obviously if Ricken and Kehl aren't getting along, then Ricken can obviously get rid of Kehl. And this is what has happened. Obviously it was quite a surprising decision because of the timing. Like, it happens on a Sunday in the middle of March when you should be priming your squad planning for next season, as well as the fact that Dortmund are trying to negotiate the contract of Nico Schlotterbeck. So the fact that this happened is very surprising. However, Kehl has been linked as the replacement for Stefan Kuntz, who departed Hamburg at the beginning of the year. He's been linked as his replacement. So, potentially, Kehl moving or being let go is related to this in some degree. We just don't know it yet. Because, to just get rid of him out of the blue is a questionable decision unless there's some sort of catalyst. So if, in a week or 2 time, Kehl is announced as, the managing director of sport for Hamburg, then we'll know why. And that obviously resulted in question marks, who's going to replace Kehl? This is quite a questionable decision to make who can replace him. Obviously, the name Markus Krösche was mentioned. He's at Frankfurt. But ultimately, Dortmund have hired Niels Ole Buch, who was the sporting director of Elversberg, which is a slightly left field decision. If, for a team the stature of Dortmund in the context of German football, you're hiring him from basically a small town team in the Saarland. Obviously, Elversberg have been very good, in terms of their scouting and stuff. I mean, Buch was in charge of was the reason Elversberg appointed Horst Steffen. They managed to get Nick Voltemar, the Paul Vanner, Fisnik Aslani in on loan. He scouted and signed Yunus Ebni Talib from the middle of butt-fuck nowhere. And obviously we saw how Ebni Talib did at the beginning of this season. And so he's really been one of, if not the mastermind behind Elversberg's success. Now, obviously, how do you deal with the politics that is Borussia Dortmund? How do you deal with someone saying, we must finish second? Please don't say we want to challenge for titles, for example. And obviously you're working at a completely different level as well. You're no longer plucking players from the 3rd tier of Italian football. You're now trying to find the next big thing in the 2nd division of France or a lower team in Spain, for example. This is what you're dealing with. And obviously it's whether Dortmund want to be stingy too, because then obviously you just carry on with what Buch was doing at Elversberg. But I think this makes this summer then all the more interesting for Dortmund, because this summer's meant to be all big change. They're letting go of Niklas Süle, Julian Brandt. They're hoping Schlotterbeck signs. It said they want to return to wingers. It said they want to sign Jadon Sancho, but now that Kehl has been fired, Sancho may not return, and I think it'd be interesting to see what Buch does, because obviously he's working at a completely different level. Are you able to transfer your skills at Elversberg to Dortmund? Are you going to be able to sign, the pressure of the success of a 300k player at Elversberg is not as great as a 30 million player at Dortmund. So it's completely different worlds and completely different areas. And I think it will be interesting where this goes and how it will manage. Apparently, Buch is a Dortmund fan. He obviously also attracted interest from the likes of Wolfsburg and Borussia Mönchengladbach in the summer, but he turned them down and stayed at Elversberg. It said that he wanted to wait for a bigger club. Obviously, the second biggest club in Germany approaches you, then you're okay, I'd be an idiot to turn this down. But I think this will be interesting now. obviously Dortmund's season's over, so like they've got nothing to worry about. So I think it will be interesting who potentially they get linked with and who actually they end up signing as well, which I think will be interesting and one to watch. Then on Saturday, Mainz beat Eintracht Frankfurt 2-1 thanks to Paul Nabel double. Is Albert Riera's second loss in charge. This has actually allowed, like, they're 8 points off 6, which is a bit of a problem, and has allowed Freiburg to come close to them. A big win for Mainz in the fact they're now pulled away from the relegation zone. They're 6 points ahead of St. Pauli, 7 games left. They've managed to turn things around, as well as the fact they're in the quarterfinals of the Conference League, and they're playing against Strasbourg, which I think could be an interesting matchup because Strasbourg are obviously a team that punches above their weight, and they're basically Chelsea 2.0. But for Frankfurt, what was interesting is after the game, there was Albert Riera basically criticised his team for their lack of creativity in the final third and a lack of ability to play the final ball in the final third. Basically, he said, I'm not a magician. The players need to be good, and said he tells his players, you have, if you don't play a good pass, you're worth 5 million. If you play a good final pass, you're worth 50 million. And so this is actually Riera's first proper break that he gets with the team, 2 weeks. So I think it'd be interesting how Frankfurt come out after the international break, because it gives him proper time to work with the team. Obviously, speaking of Freiburg, they did beat St. Pauli 2-1. St. Pauli obviously missed a chance to open the gap with Wolfsburg further. Obviously, with Freiburg, basically Freiburg and Frankfurt are fighting for 7th in the hope that Bayern or Stuttgart or Leverkusen win the Pokal. Obviously, Freiburg could win the Pokal and not finish 7th, and they'll be in Europe. But they're in the hope that one of the teams that's not named Freiburg wins, so then 7th becomes a European spot. But obviously, as we mentioned, Freiburg are also in the Europa League, and so could go from anywhere from the Champions League to the Conference League, depending on how their season ends. They win the Europa League, which is obviously becoming an increasingly possibility. You're in the Champions League. You win the Pokal, you're in the Europa League. You finish 7th, but one of the other teams win the Pokal, you're in the Conference League. And both the teams are inconsistent. They have more or less the same record in the past 5 games. And I think it will be interesting. Obviously, the permutations, what happens? Obviously, 7th could become a place if Germany qualify, get the top extra Champions League spot. Same with 8th, whatever. And then to round it all up, Augsburg played Stuttgart right at the end of the game in my hated 7:30 slot, and it was relentless from Stuttgart. They won 5-2. Dennis Undav scored twice. He could have actually had a hat-trick with the last goal, but he did decide to square it to Dennis Undav instead. But the biggest talk around Stuttgart was, he's been called up now because of injuries, but Angelo Stiller's snub from the national team. And I think you could even extend it to Maximilian Mittelstadt too. 2 years ago, Nagelsmann called Mittelstadt the best left back in Europe, and now he's not even in the national team, which I think is quite funny. But Stiller, it's such a mind-boggling thing. Nagelsmann's how he views the midfield in Germany. Everyone else says it should be Stiller and Pavlovic for the mid. If you play 4-2-3-1, the two should be Stiller and Pavlovic going forward. However, Nagelsmann seems to like the idea of playing Leon Goretzka at the World Cup, which, as I've gone over, is a questionable decision, especially because he's not even a starter for Bayern. And then you've got the likes of Felix Metscher, who's also injured, Anton Stack. It's not as even if Stiller's been bad. He's literally a starring role in a Stuttgart side who are 3rd. That should tell you everything you need to know. And the fact that Nagelsmann initially didn't call him up is quite questionable. And obviously on the national team, do I think Leonard Carl's there to be used? No, I imagine it's going to be like Seidel Mala, and he's just going to there for the experience. Again, that takes up a spot. And then it's the Leroy Sané, who's been shit for Galatasaray. Then you've got Kai Havertz, who is not fit, or he's barely playing for Arsenal as he builds up fitness. It just doesn't make sense. you're banking on the fact that Havertz will be able to find his form. It's gotten to the point where you have to be choosing players based on form. You can't be bringing in Kai Havertz on merit, because he's been out of the national team for nearly 2 years, or for 18 months. And so you should give the opportunity to the likes of Dennis Undav, who is by far Germany's best striker at the moment. And he can play he can play in whatever position Havertz can play in too. And if not, you swap him around with Nick Woltermacher. So I think there's genuinely something wrong with Nagelsmann, with the decisions he's been making with the choice of team. I think you're choosing players who are involved with the failures of the past 2 World Cups. Granted, I'm not including Kimmich in that. Antonio Rudiger, Serge Gnabry, Leon Goretzka, Leroy Sané. All of these players were involved in the shit show that was 2022. And the likes of Goretzka and Gnabry, well, Goretzka more likely, and were there in 2018 too. It's getting to the point where you just have to cut ties with it all and move on. Because these players aren't contributing anything to the national team, especially compared to the younger players who would be able to do such a thing. Because last summer, I was at the Nations League. Germany struggled against these good players, like the teams that you could consider favourites for the World Cup this summer. Or they didn't struggle, they were unlucky against France. But even then, that was with Dennis Undav playing. So, I genuinely think the decisions that Nagelsmann is making is really questionable. And if Germany get eliminated at the World Cup earlier than they hope, so let's say round of 16, then I think the criticisms and question marks around Nagelsmann is entirely justified. So, the table, obviously, Bayern remain first quite comfortably, and there's not really anything more to say about that. Dortmund is still second, again, no change yet. Then Stuttgart are third, Leipzig are now fourth, and Hoffenheim are fifth. Stuttgart have a 3-point lead over Leipzig and Hoffenheim, who are both on 50 points. While Leverkusen are sixth, 4 points behind Hoffenheim. At the bottom, Heidenheim is still last. Wolfsburg are 17th on 21. They're 3 points behind St. Pauli in 16th. Next time will be after the international break. So the standout game is Stuttgart versus Borussia Dortmund. That is obviously in the pursuit of Champions League spot. I think it'll be a good game. And then you've got all the relegation teams not playing anyone in the relegation spot, like Wolfsburg against Leverkusen, St. Pauli against Union, Cologne versus Frankfurt, Werder Bremen versus Leipzig, for example. So that is it for today. Let me know what you think about the likes of Sebastian Kehl getting sacked, Lukas Kwasniok getting sacked, their replacements, and just overall what you think of the match day.